All right, everyone, and that is our cue. We are live. Welcome. We have a stellar panel here today, which I will introduce in a moment. And I want to just remind you all of a few housekeeping items before we get started. First and foremost, my name is Savannah Lane. I'm very excited to join and just serve as the moderator and stewardess for this conversation. I'm sure I will be learning as much as you all here in the audience. So we're looking forward to welcoming you. This conversation is going to be robust and dynamic, featuring the developments in Kuwait and the region and so much more. So again, we are excited to host you all virtually today. We wish it was in person, but of course, for the time being, we are just grateful for the panelists and experts that we have here with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to go straight into the bios. They are shortened because of time, so I want to make sure that our audience knows that they can reference these wonderful panelists online as well. So for sake of time, we will just do a brief introduction and start right away with questions. So we are looking forward to diving deeper with you all here. So first and foremost, I want to introduce Dr. Cinzia Bianco, who is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, based in Berlin, where she is working on political, security, and economic developments in the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf region and relations with Europe. Additionally, she is a senior analyst at Gulf State Analytics. Dr. Sami Al-FARAJ, who I know is here just joining us on the call right now, so thank you for joining us, was educated at the Kuwait Military Academy and the universities of Kuwait, Cambridge, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and Oxford. He's a consultant to numerous Kuwaiti and Gulf ruling families, GCC, public and private agencies on strategic planning, decision-making, and crisis management. Dr. Sami heads the Kuwait Center for Strategic Studies, which he established in 1998 as the first private consultancy on strategic issues in the Gulf region. And certainly last but not least, we have Sinem CENGİZ, who is a Turkish political analyst, born and actually lived for quite a long time in Kuwait, from what I understand. Sinem focuses mainly on issues regarding the Middle East and Turkey's relation with the region, particularly the Gulf. She's a columnist at Arab News, where she writes extensively about Ankara's foreign policy in the Arab world, and previously was the former diplomatic correspondent for an English daily newspaper in Turkey. So first, thank you so much for the wonderful panelists that we have joining us today. As a reminder, I am going to make sure that we stay on track for time. So I will be the stewardess of time, and if I need to cut you all off, we will do it for the sake of time and, of course, not your remarks. So first and foremost, I want to start and turn it over to Dr. Bianco, Cinzia, if you will. I want to start and kind of look at where we have been before we look ahead at where we are going. So talk to us a little bit and share with our audience a little bit about what the last 4 years of President Donald Trump's administration had on the impact of Kuwait's foreign policy.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be together with old friends and new friends and colleagues talking about Gulf geopolitics. So we have to first and foremost say that the last 4 years, the presidency of Donald Trump have been quite unique in the scenario of, in particular, of the Gulf. Of course, we have witnessed some good degree of unpredictability from the U.S. in the past few years, and we have seen some periodic assertiveness from the president that was largely based upon his relations with different Gulf players. So there was an alignment which was evident in the policy as well with some Gulf countries, for instance, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and there was a little more odd relationship with other Gulf countries, including, of course, Qatar, given that, for instance, President Trump famously supported the choice to extend a political boycott and economic embargo against Qatar in 2017, but also some distance with countries like Kuwait and Oman. And here I come to your question more specifically. Kuwait is quite unique in the GCC, together with Oman, but in a different way, for being the champion of moderation and mediation among the GCC countries. And so they have, for instance, worked tirelessly to try and mend relations between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which resulted, of course, in the agreement of January 2021, where there was, in fact, a detente between the sides. And so that, you know, it was very, it required a lot of political capital, a lot of efforts, and it was done to a certain extent against the dominant current, which was for a time also endorsed by the US administration. But at the same time, together with some US institutions, such as the State Department and the Pentagon, which had always been of the opinion that the intra-GCC crisis was a destabilizing choice for Gulf geopolitics. So Kuwait basically, in a nutshell, navigated these differences and idiosyncrasies in a way that put and managed to further, to a certain extent, their traditional values and traditional priorities, which includes fostering some sort of consensus within the GCC monarchies, especially on regional questions.
Thank you, Cinzia. That's a great overview, I think, to kick off this wonderful panel. And I should mention, and I should have said this in the beginning too, I want to make a note that this, of course, is hosted by DİPAM and Gulf State Analytics for this conversation. So, Sinem, I want to turn to you. You know, talk to us a little bit off of, you know, what Cinzia has opened up this conversation in terms of the impact of the past 4 years on, you know, the geopolitical policies that we have seen develop, and especially within Kuwait's foreign policy.
First of all, I agree with Cinzia on most of the points. Yes, US and Kuwait are traditionally strategic allies in the Middle East. However, the last recent US administration's policies and the statements caused, as everyone else knows, caused some confusion and less confidence within the Gulf capitals in the past few years. But of course, we need to differentiate the Trump era with the Obama period. In Obama era, we saw a lot of, let's say, harsh way of dealing with the US, since US, they were considered by the US as hesitant stance in Syria, and then the Iranian nuclear deal, and, you know, the Obama's statement of the free riders for the Gulf leaders. All these had prompted a harsh stance, but Kuwait differs from the other Gulf countries in perceiving the US actions and the policies in the region. I would say specifically there are 3 developments that was perceived differently by the other Gulf countries and Kuwait in the Trump era. First of all, Trump administration's role in the Gulf crisis. And the second, the Trump administration's role in the normalization of the process between Israel and some of the other Gulf countries. And the thirdly, Trump administration's withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal. So these 3 developments were not quite positively received by the Kuwait city. And as we remember, for example, when anti-Iran bloc within the GCC, they supported the Iranian nuclear deal's withdrawal, but US did, Kuwait did not supported this. And in contrast, Kuwait was supportive for the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal. And when Trump administration decided to withdraw, Kuwait reacted to it. Kuwait's former Deputy Foreign Minister Jarallah even stated that existence of such a deal is better than no existing. So given the proximity of Iran to Kuwait, a deal between US and Iran, or lack of such a deal between these two, is of great importance for a small country like Kuwait. And also in the Trump era, there is this Gulf crisis. As you know, Kuwait tried to mediate, and despite Trump administration's initial support to the anti-Qatar bloc, Kuwait presented itself as a problem solver, as a mediator, and expected US support actually, but this didn't happen either. While Kuwait's priority was to resolve this crisis as soon as possible and unify the GCC, Trump administration's priority was the increase of the arms sales. So the Trump administration's policy of neither resolving nor allowing the crisis to escalate into a war, confused Kuwait's mediation efforts. And this also, rather, the normalization process was another thing that Kuwait reacted. As you know, Kuwait did not support Trump's normalization process as well, and opposed the Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and also even did not attend to the US-sponsored workshop at Bahrain in 2019, which the administration proposed an economic proposal for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So also when considering Trump administration withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal, we know that Kuwait is different than the other GCC countries in its perception of Iran and in the way of dealing with Iran in the region. So this was the third, I would say, the third topic, I think, in the Kuwaiti-US relations during the Trump era had significantly affected the relationships. And now there is this Biden administration, of course, and there is this understanding that there won't be the pressure on Kuwait to normalize relations with Israel. And the Kuwaitis also think that the Biden administration might bring some positive things, but I think there's something that should be kept in mind. The trends in the Kuwaiti society should be very much carefully followed by the Biden administration, especially how they perceive the Iran as a neighbor, how to perceive the normalization with Israel, and how did they perceive the Qatar crisis. And now there's a resolution and it has relieved Kuwait to a certain extent. So also there's an understanding of this US, having a kind of an approach and understanding to the Asia, and there is this understanding that US declining influence is there in the Gulf. So when considering Kuwait's role, Kuwait has been a very important ally to US since the Gulf War. And I would say this shouldn't be that much exaggerated, although Kuwait is diversifying its economic, security, and diplomatic partnerships in the past few years with China, Russia, and Turkey, and several other actors. Still, the US occupies a very important place in Kuwait's relationship in the region. I don't think China or any other global actor can or will want to fill that vacuum that they say so. And when considering that approximately 13,000 US troops are deployed in Kuwait, which makes about 1/3 of the whole US deployment in the region, right, including Iraq and Afghanistan. So I believe even now there is this ceasefire proposal coming from the Saudi side to the Yemen, and this also relieves a bit Kuwait as which is a traditional mediator in the region. So I believe Washington's approach towards Kuwait will remain fairly stable, regardless also of who is the president, because even the times when Kuwait's foreign policy differed than with the US, the relationship was always based upon this stability and the security as the main aspects. So I believe this would be the track that would be followed in the following years.
Thank you, Sinem. We're definitely going to touch on Israel and the Biden administration and so much more. So I think you really teed us up. And Dr. Sami, we're coming to you next. So if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, Sinem touched on a lot of important aspects. Obviously, Kuwait has a really important aspect within the U.S. Foreign policy, regardless, as Sinem and Cinzia essentially mentioned, in terms of both Trump and the Biden administration currently, but even going back to the Obama administration, of course. So just to open us up where we are here today, Dr. Sami, can you let us know your thoughts, especially from your experience working so long in this field, of the impact of the Trump administration on Kuwait's foreign policy? And Dr. Sami, if I can, you are still muted. So if you want to unmute yourself, please, then we can go ahead and hear you okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think Kuwait is one of the powers in the Gulf that there is a pattern for Kuwaiti foreign policy. You follow historical lines and you'll see the same thing being repeated. I mean, Kuwait is a country that will not come out of the pack. Kuwait will always be with its allies all the time. It will not go against their wills unless they are really contrary to its national interest, in the sense to its survival. So it will always be with its allies. Now, within the GCC, Kuwait has always played the diplomatic power. One other aspect of Kuwait is that it does not really, since its beginning, when it was a military power in the Northern Gulf, it really looked at power as a multifaceted thing. There is diplomatic power, financial power, and as well as military power. So it always used all aspects or all facets of power. A third thing is that Kuwait would not want to. Kuwait lives, in the shade of balance of power in the Gulf. It does not want any power to exceed, to want to add to its margin of power against the interests of others. And therefore, when you look at Kuwait today does not want Iran to be a super regional power, and it does not want Saudi Arabia to be either. And it has a problem now with Saudi Arabia over the boundaries, because moving ahead north, the Saudis gaining more of Kuwaiti boundaries and Kuwaiti oil-rich territories means increase in Saudi financial power. And therefore, Kuwait is against that. With regard to Saudi flexing the muscles against Qatar at the beginning of the crisis, Kuwait did not want a smaller power, a small fish like Qatar, or to be really squeezed by Saudi Arabia. And Oman and Kuwait understood that if they allowed that they will be next after Qatar. So if you look at all these are, especially the Omanis and the Kuwaitis, being two of the oldest powers in the region, one north, one south. They followed patterns in behaving with the other Gulf states. With regard to the administration, the Trump administration, Kuwait understood that it was, in a sense, one favorite of the Trump administration with regard to its diplomatic efforts, but with regard to basically supporting Trump policies, especially vis-a-vis Iran and the other one regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict, Kuwait, you could say, that just stood in the shade, waiting for things to change, or waiting for momentum. I mean, in Kuwait, the dominant belief is that Kuwait will join the pack one day and and gets, and establishes relations with Israel, but not so soon. It needs to wait to see what is going to develop. So this was one important element in the Trump administration's foreign policy. The other one is that the Saudis wanting to balance Iran by relying on US power and by buying lots of US gear. I am not here speaking on behalf of the government, but I think the Saudis massing military equipment and weapon system really scares the Kuwaitis, or the leadership of Kuwait. It scares actually the Omanis, it scares, of course, the Qataris, and I am sure it does not really bode well for the Bahrainis or the Emiratis on the long term. what bin Salman has in mind for Saudi Arabia is something that really concerns the Kuwaitis, and therefore they are careful with regard to the evolution or development of foreign policy vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. And that was an important subject of concern for the Kuwaitis during the Trump administration. The Kuwaitis, busied themselves with the two crises in the area. That is the Qatar crisis, and the second one was the Yemen crisis. We don't want any, winner in the conflict in Yemen. That is another feature of Kuwaiti strategy. We don't want anybody to really triumph over others. We don't want anybody to really lose, lose influence so dramatically, like, by military force. We think Kuwaiti foreign policy, or people in charge of Kuwaiti foreign policy, think they can really deal with Iran on the long term, the diplomatic front, and they are. If they want to be steadfast against Iranian desires and wishes, Kuwait, nobody noticed that, but Kuwait has actually had a diplomatic crisis with Iran. The Iranians, for the past 4 years, refused to allow the Kuwaiti ambassador to return to Tehran unless Kuwait releases the people who were locked up as part of a terrorist group related to Hezbollah 4 years ago, when they were sent 4 years ago. So Kuwait can understand that it can withstand pressure from Iran on certain issues. But the issue, now we have an issue which is in the military front, that Iran is shooting those unmanned drones against Saudi Arabia. And by the reasons of geography, Kuwait is in the middle in this duel between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Iranians, as you very well know, cannot penetrate northern Saudi borders, so they fly over them. And when they fly over them, whether by missiles or by drones, they fly or closer to Kuwait, and this ought to really put the Kuwaiti, or charges the Kuwaiti with the responsibility of shooting down such drones and missiles. Why Kuwait does not shoot them down? This is, this perplexes the Saudis. But we have two issues. One issue is basically to defend the Saudis according to our treaties, but at the same time we cannot basically expose ourselves to Iranian threat and Iranian military power. So we play it really quite in a balanced and in a cool way. We saw that during the Trump administration, for instance, in this very issue, the Trump administration did not actually provide the Saudis with enough air defenses. And we had to really detail some of ours to Saudi defense, to the defense of northeastern province of Saudi Arabia. And this was an issue with the Trump administration. Now, with the passage of time, I think we can get over whatever is left of the Trump administration's, marks on the U.S. Gulf policy.
Sure. Dr. Sami, thank you so much. We are going to touch a lot more, obviously, on much that all of our speakers have discussed. So for sake of time, I want to keep it moving to the next question so that we can revisit these in a later portion of this webinar. Now, coming back to you, Cinzia, we've talked about the Trump administration, obviously the changes and what remained consistent in the region. Now talk to us about where we are now with President Joe Biden and this new administration here in DC in the White House. Can we conclude that US-Kuwait relations are back to normal? What does back to normal even mean? And is this going to be a priority in foreign policy, or are we going to see more of the domestic agenda focused during this administration because of things like, of course, COVID-19 and much more? So your thoughts on any of that?
So let's start from the beginning. We have laid out some of the challenges that the Trump administration posed to some of the Gulf countries. And at the same time, we have said that to other Gulf countries, the Trump administration was an opportunity. And therefore, we can conclude that when Biden won the presidential elections in November, there were similarly mixed reactions. And let's stick on Kuwait. Kuwait was definitely welcomed the change in the administration and anticipated some very positive developments in the so-called returning back to normal, as you called it. At the same time, there is this underlying sense all across the GCC monarchies that there is no such thing as going back to normal. There is this understanding that the US is in a different place today than it was, for instance, in the 1990s, when the US was such a precious, indispensable ally for Kuwait, vis-a-vis the invasion of Iraq, of course. So there is this understanding, there is the realization that the US is after a retrenchment from the Middle East, that the US wants to refocus on domestic priorities and channel whatever energy there is in foreign policy on the bigger challenges of great power politics, in particular against China and in particular in the Indo-Pacific area. However, having said that, while there is this realization all across the GCC countries, there is some, first of all, reticence to really accept that. Then there is, if it is accepted, then there is a pushback reaction against it. Because the Gulf, the GCC countries are still trying to argue that the Gulf is extremely important for global interests, and it is located in a strategic place of spot of the world map. It is, of course, the source of much of the energy, including the energy used by China and indispensable to China. So therefore, even in the framework of great power politics, the GCC countries, including Kuwait, are trying to argue their case with the US that they remain important strategic allies and partners. So this is ongoing as we speak. It's difficult to say more than to lay out the discussion and the debate right now as it is. But definitely, I think it is important to try and highlight the main trends in these complex questions. And from Kuwait's point of view, there is basically the same issues that we've just laid out. There are questions about commitment. So Kuwait is, of course, ready to stand and continue pushing efforts for moderation and diplomacy, especially at the regional level. They have understood that this is important for the US as well as for other Western partners, including the Europeans. Both the Americans and the Europeans have been vocal about asking Kuwaiti support, but Kuwait is also asking, what can we expect? What level of support can we expect in turn and in return from the US and other Western allies? So I think this is unfolding as we speak, and there is a lot of watch and learn right now going on in different Gulf capitals.
Certainly. Thank you, Cinzia. I mean, there's no question the US is obviously, as you mentioned, in a different place than, let's say, the 90s, but the world as well. So I think that there's obviously going to be a shift, and the watch and wait and see is going to be an important one. And Sinem, coming to you, same question here. What is a back to normal? Is that possible? And what might we expect in the region as it relates to the potential changes from the Biden administration?
Agreeing with Cinzia, what is normal is meaning In US relations with the Gulf, it has been very different than the other global powers they do. Now there is an increasing, of course, involvement of other competitive powers like Russia and China. However, US place in terms of military domain remains very strong, and this does not change with any administration, not with Obama or Bush or with Trump. The track has been same, with only some regional patterns have changed, but this is not related to the developments in the region. It's also related to the domestic transformations within this Gulf countries. So how did they responded to the, increasingly competitive nature of the region? So Biden, I don't want to be stereotyped, but Biden administration's coming was of course positively perceived by Kuwait, while with others more skeptical, considering what could be the expectations of the Biden administration. Today, for example, is the sixth year anniversary of the war in Yemen, and on Monday we heard about the ceasefire proposal, as I had mentioned, and there's very much statements that this has been the reason of the Biden administration's presence and the influence, and also this has been said for the Al-Ula declaration. These are two developments definitely considered very positive by Kuwait, because Kuwait, as a traditional mediator in the region, was very much exhausted. And now there is the new leadership, of course, Sheikh Nawaf and the Crown Prince and they will try to probably follow the same track, but they of course lack the diplomatic credentials as the late Emir had. So the region, the de-escalation of the tension in the region is of course a plus for Kuwaiti's new leadership, which is very much focused nowadays on domestic issues and many other things related to COVID. So I believe that in order to show its commitment to its role in the region, Kuwait will follow the same track with the US and will also but diversify its partnerships. China's, for example, foreign minister had a tour in the Gulf this week, and Kuwait's foreign minister was in Pakistan, for example, last week. And late Emir had very encouraging steps to approach to Russia and China. When considering these, we have to consider within the international context, of course, US role. We cannot just focus on what US does, but how does the other powers also affect the US roles and how the regional developments will evolve. But considering now the regional environment, it seems that things will go much more smoothly for Kuwait and US. For definitely Kuwait is relieved by its role for a while. But it seems also how the Russia and China will approach to Kuwait in the following years. This will also might affect the Kuwaiti-American relationship.
Thank you, Sinem. And Dr. Sami, what is Kuwait? And obviously we know you do not speak for the Kuwaiti government, but in your opinion, what is Kuwait seeking in terms of the Biden administration and what they can look for with the US-Kuwaiti relationship moving forward, understanding, as Cinzia and Sinem have both outlined, all of the developments that have happened geopolitically in the region and in the world at large? And if I could ask you to unmute yourself as well. Thank you.
Kuwait, she's of course is delighted for the arrival of Joe Biden at the helm of U.S. administration and foreign policy. Kuwait hopes that there will be a revival of the diplomatic efforts with Iran, whether with regard to the previous nuclear pact or another one to be negotiated between the US administration, other powers, and Iran. The second thing is, again, an even-handed approach to Yemen. During the Trump administration, there was just support for Saudi policy in Yemen. Now, with the declaration of the Saudi intent on, a ceasefire from their side, this really revives the efforts of diplomacy as a whole in the region. Although, with regard to the ability of the new administration in Kuwait to really play the right cards in foreign policy. What is important here is that Sheikh Sabah, the former emir, was looked upon by the Saudis as a competitor, especially by Mohammed bin Salman. And now with the arrival of this new administration, Mohammed bin Salman needs not to worry with regard to that. The second thing is the Crown Prince of Kuwait has got better, relationship with Mohammed bin Salman. So we could hope for better cooperation between the two with regard to, regional issues like Yemen or like Iran. Of course, the Saudi would still hope that we will we revive our role with regard to Iran and Yemen, and of course, but with regard to Qatar, I don't think they are very excited about that. Kuwait is so far, as you very rightly said, are at the moment very concentrating very much on the domestic issue and domestic issues, and I guess the foreign policy issues are coming later, but they will be coming later with more probably intensity if the U.S. administration moves forward into what it has already said to continue to be the power broker in the region. With regard to China, there is also India, and Kuwait has to be even-handed between the two. But with regard to economic cooperation, China will be ahead, and therefore Kuwait cannot really control the speed by which Kuwait-China relations are improving. I don't think this is going to be an issue with the United States, because Kuwait has always offered that in its foreign policy declaration, offered many channels for U.S. economic power to be exercised. One is inside Kuwait for the Kuwaiti Vision 2035. The second one is cooperation over the reconstruction of Syria and Iraq.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. It's certainly a lot to pull from and to continue to watch and see, as our other panelists have mentioned. Now, I want to transition a little bit, as we had mentioned earlier. Obviously, one item that we cannot ignore, Israel. Unique enough in that they have their elections, obviously, this weekend, the debacle from that. But I want to focus more so on how Kuwait sees this trend, Cinzia, I'll point this to you, among Arab states to either fully formalize diplomatic relations with Israel, or at least gradually move in that direction. Is Kuwait going to continue this opposition, or is this a trend that we're going to continue to see being pushed for normalization? And is the Biden administration going to shift that trend? So feel free to talk on any of those items.
Thank you. So no, I don't think that the Biden administration will massively shift on that trend. I think that they will still pursue any opportunity that they have to further usher in more normalization deals with Israel. Having said that, they will not be doing it in a way that would make the regional partners feel cornered or coerced, or in any way could disrupt the political stability of their regional interlocutor. And that, I think, would be the case in Kuwait. So I do not think that we can expect Kuwait to normalize relations with Israel anytime soon. And it is not because of any particular hostility vis-a-vis Israel that is in any way comparable to the ideological existential hostility that we see from other countries such as Iran. It is mostly because the Palestinian question has become embedded into the political discourse in Kuwait, and it is upheld in the parliament by a number of political societies who use this and talk about this issue to their constituencies, to the public opinion, to the ordinary Kuwaitis, in a way that has really sensitized these constituencies on the question of the Palestinian cause. So it's very difficult to imagine that, especially at a time when there are already substantial difficulties between the government and the parliament, the National Assembly, and the government has so many other priorities, so many more other priorities that they want to bring the National Assembly on board with, that they would try to push such a contentious and controversial issue that doesn't have any immediate clear-cut benefit for Kuwait in any, way, shape, or form from a geopolitical point of view in particular. I'll stop here just by mentioning as a final point that the reason why the Palestinian cause is so dear to many Kuwaitis is also to do with a long period in Kuwaiti history where Kuwait was one of the strong proponents in the Arab world of Arab causes in general, and the idea of inter-Arab solidarity. So this is a historical background. I don't want to be blind to the fact that, of course, it wasn't always an easy issue. It also is a contentious issue, but to a certain extent, it still resonates today within the wider public.
Thank you, Cinzia. And certainly it is a contentious issue, obviously not even contained even in this region. Here in the United States, it does play certainly a role in foreign policy and major discrepancies between this. So you are certainly correct in recognizing that. Sinem, I want to hear your thoughts on this normalization of relations and diplomatic relations with Israel, especially as it relates to Kuwait, and any other thoughts to show agreement or not with Cinzia and kind of this trend that we are seeing moving forward in the region.
Actually, the past few years has shown that it has become clear that each of the Gulf country is having its own national interests and unique history of how they perceive the issue of Palestine. And these have shaped their changing perception regarding this. And there is no monolithic GCC policy regarding the regional issues, and there's no also united stance towards the Abraham Accords. So Kuwait has been an exception in this pattern of rejecting the normalization with Israel, and it is a country which has hosted the majority of the Palestinians in the region, and Kuwait has been rejecting this for several other reasons, which also Cinzia have pointed out, and I would like to add some little bit more examples for the historical dimension. Kuwait's foreign policy is not formed solely at the top as elsewhere in the Gulf. There is public opinion and the domestic politics, they matter. And so not only the public opinion, but also the Kuwaiti decision makers are against the idea of having the diplomatic relations with Israel anytime soon. Dr. Sami has referred that it might be in the future, so it remains to be seen. It's related to a lot of developments, in the international and global and even domestic context, what would happen. But the factors related to Kuwait's political institutions, let's say, leadership stance towards the Arab and Muslim solidarity, historical ties with the Palestine, and the public opinion, these all play a significant role in making the Kuwait the only GCC country, or how the Kuwaiti officials say, as the last country to normalize relations with Israel. So Kuwait, as Cinzia has said, has a functioning parliament, which is unique in the region, which includes members from Shia community, Muslim Brotherhood, and and liberals, and most of them are opposed to the idea of the normalization. When this issue was on the agenda, as you remember, 37, as far as I remember, MP had opposed, and they even proposed some kind of a letter about this issue. And also, I think the Kuwait's constitution have articles related, Article 1 and Article 12, I think is related to the solidarity of Islam and Arabism, which I believe is not very much related in the other GCC countries. So it has a strong, this composition in the political environment and the public opinion has a strong influence on the foreign policy making in the country. So also, unlike UAE and Bahrain, which are relatively newer countries than Kuwait, because Kuwait was established in 1961, while the others a decade after, Kuwait in 1967 joined the Arab coalition in their fight against Israel, and also the old-aged leadership in Kuwait still has the memories of this Arab-Israeli war. And during also the 1992 and 1997, there was multilateral talks between Gulf and Israel. At that time, the Gulf countries, they hosted these multilateral talks, and even Qatar and Oman exchanged trade offices with Israel. Kuwait did not join this pattern at that time even. And also there's another historical fact I would like to touch upon. In 1990 invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the Palestinians and PLO, some of the Palestinians, let's not say majority, but PLO stood by the side of Iraq. And despite, you know, Arafat's position in favor of Iraq during the invasion, this has caused a big disappointment within the Kuwaiti society and the Kuwaiti leadership. Kuwait still maintained its sympathy towards the Palestinian cause. And moreover, the Kuwaiti Palestinian relations have started to develop further in 2004 when Mahmoud Abbas, he apologized for the Palestinian support to Iraq during the war, and also when Abbas traveled to Kuwait to reopen the Palestinian embassy, which was shut down after the invasion. This have led a kind of a coziness between two sides. And also when Trump administration decided to end its foundations to the United Nations agency and work reliefs for the Palestinians, Kuwait decided to donate, approximately $50 million per year for the Palestinians, and it decided to further increase its raise. And it's one of the largest countries, largest donor countries for the Palestinian cause, in addition to Syria, in addition to construction of Iraq. So this fact of Arabism and the Islam of the solidarity is still very, new when considered to the new generations within the Gulf countries. The Kuwaiti leadership is still relatively with the old age and with the old generation. There's no yet a transformation done in a significant matter, as Cinzia would also agree on this, I guess. So I think these factors will be very much important in the following years, how Kuwait will perceive this normalization with Israel.
Certainly, Sinem, thank you for bringing that in. I mean, you both have touched on great points. And so quickly, Dr. Sami, I want to get your take on this before we move on to the next question, because we are quickly running out of time. But Dr. Sami, touching on what both Sinem and Cinzia have mentioned, is it this, traditional aspect of, solidarity and, the historical aspects that we are seeing continue to filter in as it relates to the normalization or opposition, I should say, of the normalization with Israel? Talk to us a little bit about, from your perspective, Kuwait's role in this and the future that we might expect.
I would like to remind my colleagues that the Kuwaiti parliament, for instance, since its early days, played a role as the platform from which Arab concerns and Muslim concerns and international concerns are aired. Kuwait looks at the Palestinian issue from different aspects, not necessarily the political, historical aspect with Israel, but also, human rights, economic needs, and Kuwait plays practical roles with regard to that. Second element, an important element today is, the the area is still, restive with pro-Palestinians, especially in Iraq, especially in Iran. And these are two big giants, and Saudi Arabia has not made a move. And therefore, the three big giants surrounding Kuwait have not made any move regarding, normalization with Israel, so Kuwait would not. Even if we, believe that the Saudis are going to move ahead with the normalization with Israel, there remains, Iran and pro-Iranian elements in Iraq. And the issue of Kuwaitis making peace with Israel would be used, Kuwaiti believe, would be used by Iranians, pro-Iranian elements, not only in Iraq, but also in Kuwait proper, against Kuwait. And therefore, the issue of national security is very important. With regard to history plays a role. And with regard to the age group is very important. And they still live on the same ideas of the past, that they would, Palestine would be liberated, or at least the Arabs and Israelis would agree on a solution that would really serve the interests of both. Kuwait still abides by the Beirut Conference, King Abdullah, or the Arab Initiative of 2002. Prior to that, in 1982, so-called King Fahd formula or initiative. And therefore, it says, it plays for time and says there has to be really a collective move on the lines of these initiatives, and with the acceptance and the involvement of the Palestinians. This would basically not going to play well with the Israelis, and therefore there will be time, and this time is very much important for the Kuwaitis now as they organize themselves.
Thank you. Now, unfortunately, we are getting close to the end of time, so I'm going to go ahead and just combine some of our last themes, and I'll just remind our speakers to keep it brief so that we can get through it all. Cinzia, back to you. First, we've touched quite a bit on this conversation, the theme of how Kuwait positions itself in between, such a difficult geographic, literally and figurative moment in the region. So between Turkey, Iran, fellow GCC member states, namely Saudi Arabia, and of course UAE. So we have this aspect of just positioning oneself, one. And secondly, I want to look more ahead. We've really seen kind of the trends, in years past, where we are now, and looking ahead, as we know the Al-Ula Accord is signed. Will Kuwait remain the Gulf's chief mediator? What can we expect from this? So feel free to touch on any of those themes. Thank you.
I think I can sort of combine the answer, because there is, I think, one overarching theme, which is related to what we were saying when we talked about prospects under a Biden administration. So we cannot have the expectation that Kuwait would manage by itself to not only further keep its sort of ability to navigate and position and keep a balanced position between the regional rivals and regional powers, and at the same time be a chief mediator, because Kuwait itself has its own concerns about domestic challenges, not only COVID-19 as every other country in the world, but also the related economic challenges and socioeconomic challenges that have already trickled down to socio-political questions, to political instability, to a contentious relationship between the government and the National Assembly. These are all questions that, to a certain extent, can be leveraged into vulnerabilities by other regional players if they perceive that they can, that they need to use pressure points against Kuwait, maybe even to sabotage mediation efforts in some contexts where these regional players do not believe that it is in their best interest to engage in mediation efforts. So I think the bottom line of what we can expect in the future in terms of Kuwait's positioning and Kuwait's ability to mediate on the hottest topics is we have to look at Kuwait's own challenges and domestic situation, and be prepared to really support and back up Kuwait in these mediation efforts. And here I'm speaking, of course, first and foremost of those European and American players who do have a vested interest in the success of Kuwait's mediation efforts.
Thank you, Cinzia. A great look forward as to what we might expect. And Sinem, same question, first of all, how does, especially from you, as I know you are in Turkey right now, how does Kuwait position itself amongst, Turkey, Iran, the GCC, so many more in the region? And then looking ahead, what is Kuwait's role that we might expect moving forward? Is it going to continue to be that main mediator piece?
Let's start from the backwards about the Kuwait's chief mediator role. Is it going to remain or not? Kuwait is a small country aware of its strengths and limitations, located among the tough neighbors and having internal sensitive dynamics. It's very likely that it has to rely actually on two soft power tools, which I consider as mediation and a foreign aid in order to achieve its foreign policy goals, which is to maintain its national security and also the stability in the region. So Kuwait's preference, according to me, to rely on these soft power tools are related to realist and constructivist concerns, which is very much related to what it had experienced in the past in the invasion, because late emirs decades-long emphasis on diplomacy was not only the reflection of his personal skill, but it was also an external strategy related to Kuwait's geographic vulnerability. And this vulnerabilities and the regional crisis is very much likely to have repercussions in the domestic level, because this is a country having diverse population in sociopolitical and sectarian terms. So since then, the invasion, Kuwait has been following up a neutral foreign policy in its regional relations, and also in order to address its national security concerns, it has to rely on diplomatic tools, because Kuwait's priority is this, because it in addressing regional challenges, because it has not aspired to spend financially on military, on building the military as its neighbors does, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, or Qatar. So even against this backdrop, it was not a surprise that Kuwait's succession happened very fast in a speedy way. The foreign politics needs to be on track in order to address the region, domestic problems as well. So I believe that since the outbreak of the Arab uprisings, Kuwait has been facing a lot of challenges in terms of foreign policy. And this is forcing Kuwait to adopt external strategy based on regional balance in dealing with Turkey, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, with the other regional countries. And for example, when considering Kuwait's own domestic environment and how it's reflected to foreign policy and its mediation role, Kuwait did not, for example, participated in Bahrain intervention with troops, but sent naval forces. It did not take part in the Qatar crisis, in the anti-Qatar bloc, or it did not follow its military role in the Yemen war, but rather tried to be a mediator, a problem solver, tried to depend on diplomatic tools. In Syria war, for example, it intervened in humanitarian efforts through building aids and for the refugees. So Kuwait has relied on a flexible diplomacy when it comes to Iran to maintain its security, because the threat that it perceives, of course, from Iran is different than the other countries does, but still there is a strong neighbor on its doorstep, and there is an experience of the past, and there is this Shia population it has, although they are politically active and they are representative in the parliament, but yet Kuwait needs to calculate all these dynamics. It's very unique in terms of this, and it also follows good relations with Turkey, which I specifically want to touch upon, because much has been written about Turkey's relations with Saudi Arabia or Qatar, but not much has been written on Kuwait, how Kuwait perceives Turkey's regional policy, for example. example. Recently, Turkish foreign minister had a Gulf tour where he visited Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman. And Kuwait was the first leg of this visit. And foreign minister said it was very symbolic because Turkey wanted to show its respect to Kuwait's role in the resolution of the Gulf crisis. This visit took soon after the Al-Ula, and in which Kuwait played a very significant role as a mediator. And when considering Turkey's policies, how it had been perceived by Saudi Arabia, for example, in the past few years, it clashed with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain. In contrast, it grew with Qatar, but Turkey, in the third block of within the GCC, had a sustained and stable relations with Kuwait and Oman. Especially Turkish-Kuwait relations historically has been one of the most stable ones within the GCC context. It did not see any ups and not downs, and it did not feel the necessity for further closeness or distance due to any specific developments like it happens in the region. And also Kuwait's neutral policy is very much welcomed actually by Ankara. It's not much assertive, and I believe there are 5 motivating factors in Turkish-Kuwaiti relations. Very briefly I want to touch, because this is the context how Turkey and Kuwait course of relations continue and how Kuwait perceives Turkey. The first is the political historical dimension. The second would be the regional dimension. How do they perceive each other's regional vision? The third is the security defense dimension. The fourth is the economy dimension. And the fifth is the humanitarian aspect of these relations. So when starting with the political historical dimension, the relations have been very much improved after the Gulf War, when Turkey stood by Kuwait, and despite the costs of political and economic costs in the post-war era. And this was very much helpful in the development of Turkish-Kuwaiti relations, and also the personal relations between Turkish President Erdogan and the late Emir was quite good. Even the late Emir was given the State or Medal of Order, and also there is institutional strong ties between Turkey and Kuwait, because Kuwait has a quite meaningful institutions like its parliament, and we have friendship groups between two countries. And in this context, there's a regional vision. As you know, in the post-Arab uprisings, Saudi Arabia wanted to design the region according to its own design, and Qatar wanted to do other way. But Kuwait, caught between this competitive environment, tried to reach to any actor who could strengthen its security and its position. So Turkey, in these terms, have appeared as a good partner, I believe so. And also Kuwait's and Turkey's some foreign policy visions, they overlap, such as their perception of Iran. Both of them try to follow a flexible policy when it comes to Iran, and also their perception of Israel, while Kuwait is rejecting a normalization, and Turkey is very much actually welcoming this, because Turkey reacted harshly to Abraham Accords and is at odds with Israel at the moment. When we look at the security dimension, very briefly,
yes, okay, thank you.
The security dimension I will touch upon. There is an increasing security military relations between Turkey and Kuwait, but we need to remember in 2018, when Mohammed bin Salman had a visit to Kuwait, there were rumors that Kuwait will request from Turkey to establish a military base. But this did not happen, because Kuwait did not take a controversial step, and rather it engaged into defense agreements. Unlike Doha, it engaged into defense agreements. And in 2019, a joint defense plan was built for further military cooperation. This was also not to anger Saudi Arabia for a point, because in Gulf War, when Egyptian troops came to fight against the Iraqis, they wanted to continue their presence in Kuwait, but this was not literally allowed by Saudi Arabia. And even at that time, there was a quote said by the Western diplomat that Saudis would prefer 3,000 Americans rather than 40,000 Egyptians. So this is the perception of Saudi Arabia regarding a presence of a regional actor in terms of military domain in any other Gulf country. This was one of the reasons that Saudi-led bloc wanted from Qatar for this reason. So Kuwait, knowing this dimension and knowing this past background, was of course not going to take such a controversial step. But yet there is a very growing relationship, also in economic terms, although it's not much reflected. It's quite declined in the past few years, but there is other dimensions. Lastly, the humanitarian aspects. They are engaging into cooperation with the Syrian refugees, and there is a lot of donation done by the Kuwaiti side in this terms, helping Turkey in hosting the Syrians. So I believe these 5 motivating factors are very important in understanding how these 2 countries have developed their relations in the past few years.
Thank you, Sinem. And I know I wish we had more time for diving deeper. Obviously, there's a robust relationship between so many that we can't possibly get to today. And maybe we'll have to do a follow-up here for this guest. But Dr. Sami, turning to you, we've got 5 minutes or so left that we can extend here. I really want to hear your take on all of what we've discussed thus far. Of course, Kuwait's position in this region and Kuwait's role following the Al-Allah Accord and what this signing means for the future of the region.
I think Kuwait is playing the deal maker in the region because of its national security concerns. Surrounded by 3 powers who have military, their focus is on the military power. Kuwait can only provide such 3 powers with the service they don't have, which is to really go around and make them speak to each other via Kuwait. And if you look at the geographic location of Kuwait, Kuwait is like a mouse between 3 elephants. And once if the 3 elephants fight, Kuwait will be decimated. But if Kuwait plays its cards really well, it could be the area where they all meet and they all flourish, and their relations flourish. Let's just if you look at Kuwait from an historical perspective, Kuwait has always played what is in its interest. People did not realize that. For instance, in the past, 100 years ago or more than that, the Kuwaitis hoisted the Ottoman flags, not because of, Muslim brethren or whatever, but not because of even, Ottoman presence in the area, because the Ottoman presence at the time, in the late 19th century, was weakening, and it was more in Iraq. But because they got better tariffs in Indian ports if they hoisted the Ottoman flag. So always look at the Kuwaitis know where to find their interest all the time, and in this, in this Gulf, this Gulf is too small for what the Kuwaitis want to do, but they have to really contain themselves to this Gulf and to play their role better than ever. With regard to the diplomatic role, one Western diplomat has told me 2 years ago that most of the European diplomacy is relocating itself or positions or activities to Kuwait rather than other places like Abu Dhabi in the past or Riyadh. Now we had some embassies that are located in Kuwait and are not located in Saudi Arabia. The Kuwaitis, I'm not going to boast about Kuwaiti diplomatic power, but I think with regard to Kuwaiti role, I think that I would envisage a role where they share such deal-making capability with the Omanis. If you look at the Omanis and Kuwaitis when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, both can make a very good team. The Omanis can speak to the Israelis. The Kuwaitis can speak to the Palestinians. But nobody has utilized such a combined role of the 2 nations. Although those 2 nations have been the oldest in the area, have survived 3 centuries at least each, and they survived that based on their diplomatic power, financial power, rather than their military power. What I see for Kuwait is basically more of the same role, the role of, deal maker, because the national security of Kuwait necessitates such, such development. I don't see the Kuwaitis being, over-occupied with any other issue, but they'd rather, if they are left to their own devices, I think the Kuwaitis would prefer to play diplomacy combined with humanitarian aid on a global scale, rather than get involved, busy themselves every day in solving a crisis made by the intricate, discourse between their neighbors.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. And unfortunately, to our audience, we are out of time. I want to thank Cinzia, Sinem, and Dr. Sami so much for their remarks today for this event hosted by DİPAM and Gulf State Analytics. We've covered quite a bit, and unfortunately, there's just no more time left today to cover as much as we would want to. So thank you to our panelists for joining us. Thank you to our audience for joining us as well. And we look forward to continuing and fostering these connections and relations moving forward. Take care and have a great day.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.